At night, a lot of places run on trust more than people realize. A maintenance request gets passed along, a building is assumed to be empty, a medical order is assumed to be understood, and noise behind a wall is assumed to have an obvious source. Most of the time, those assumptions are harmless. Until one of them isn't. The stories in this video all begin with something that feels explainable enough to ignore. Then one detail shifts, and suddenly the person involved has to decide whether they're being cautious, overreacting, or noticing a problem everyone else missed. That kind of uncertainty is where these stories get uncomfortable. If you enjoy grounded horror that leaves room for doubt, consider subscribing and stick around. We're starting with an after-hours maintenance call, where everything about the request looked legitimate, except for the people waiting at the door. I was the on-call maintenance guy for a pretty big apartment complex at the time. Once the leasing office closed, anything that couldn't wait until morning pretty much became my problem. Most nights, it was boring maintenance stuff, usually a leak or somebody locking themselves out. We didn't take those calls straight from residents. An outside answering service took the call, made a work order, and sent me the basic information. With a lockout though, a work order didn't mean I could just walk up and open somebody's door. It meant I had to go out there and deal with the call. I still had to make sure the person asking to get in was actually on the lease, or that a current resident had given them permission. I could check the current resident list from my work phone, but I couldn't see the full lease history. During the day, leasing could usually straighten out anything questionable. At night, if I couldn't verify somebody, I didn't open the door. This particular call looked completely normal. The apartment number was right, and the name on the ticket was a woman who showed as a current resident. Nothing in the notes stood out. I grabbed the master key ring I used for lockouts and drove over, figuring I'd find somebody annoyed because she'd left her keys inside. When I got there were two men waiting outside the locked resident entrance to that section of the building. One of them came over and started explaining before I really had to ask much. He said he'd lived in the apartment with his girlfriend until recently. They'd broken up, the locks had been changed, and he still had some of his stuff inside. He knew her name, the apartment number, and the building, so I figured he probably had lived there. That part wasn't hard to believe. It just didn't mean I could let him in now. I asked for his ID and pulled up the resident list on my phone. His name wasn't there. I checked it again because I didn't want to turn this into an argument over me missing something stupid, but he wasn't listed. His driver's license proved who he was. It didn't prove he still had any right to that apartment. I told him that if he wasn't on the current lease and I didn't have permission from the resident, I couldn't open the door. He got irritated, but he wasn't screaming at me or threatening me. Honestly, irritated people weren't exactly unusual on night maintenance calls. He said he'd lived there until recently. His belongings were still inside, and he'd called the after-hours number specifically to get maintenance out there. His whole point was that if the company had taken his call and sent me, then somebody had already approved it. The other guy mostly backed him up. He kept saying they weren't there to cause trouble and only needed a couple of minutes. They started talking over me some, and I knew by then this wasn't a normal lockout. I understood what they wanted. I just had nothing showing me I was allowed to use my keys for them. Rather than stand there arguing about what the answering service had supposedly approved, I called them back from my work phone. I gave the operator the ticket number and asked how the request had come in. She confirmed that the work order was real and that the caller had given the correct apartment and resident name. Then I asked if they'd actually checked the caller against the lease. They hadn't. He'd given them the information, they'd taken the request, and they'd sent it to maintenance. They hadn't talked to the woman or gotten permission from her, and they hadn't verified that the guy who called was still a resident. I remember that annoying me more than anything else at first. It was such a normal chain of events. Somebody called, somebody made a ticket, and I showed up at the building carrying keys that could open the unit. Nobody before me had actually confirmed that the person waiting there had any right to get through the door. As soon as I got off the phone, the first guy said, "So the call is real?" I said, "Yeah, the call is real. That doesn't put you on the lease." He said if the company had sent me out there, I was basically adding another rule after the fact. He wanted leasing to straighten it out in the morning after he got his things. His friend kept coming back to the same thing. They only needed a couple minutes. When I still wouldn't open the apartment, they changed what they were asking for. Since we were outside the locked resident entrance, they asked if I could at least let them through that door so they could wait closer to the apartment or see if she'd come back. From my side, that was still the same problem. If I used the master key to put them inside a secured part of the building, I was giving them access they hadn't shown they were supposed to have. By then, they were both frustrated and talking over me, acting like I was turning a simple favor into some huge paperwork issue. I had two guys standing there, neither one on the resident list, and no permission from the woman whose apartment it actually was. That was enough for me to keep the keys with me and say no. The first guy kept pushing. He said he wasn't trying to move back in, he just wanted his stuff. Then he said pretty casually that she wasn't even home and wouldn't be back until later, so they weren't going to bother anybody. Up until then, I could still picture this as a messy breakup and a guy choosing a stupid way to get his belongings back. Maybe he really did think calling maintenance was how he was supposed to handle it. I couldn't know. But hearing that made one thing pretty clear. He'd called us out there expecting to get inside, while the woman who actually lived there wasn't around to approve it or tell us no. I didn't ask him how he knew when she'd be back. I wasn't going to get into whatever was going on between them, and for my job, it didn't matter. I told him one last time that if he wasn't on the lease and I didn't have permission from a current resident, I wasn't opening the apartment and I wasn't letting them through the resident entrance. I put the master key ring away. I'd been holding it because I'd shown up expecting to use it, but there was no reason to keep it in my hand while two guys argued with me about making an exception. I told them I'd mark the call as access not verified, and that anything else had to go through the leasing office or the resident herself. The first guy went back to saying I'd already been sent there, and his belongings were inside. His friend said I was making something simple harder than it needed to be. At that point, it was the same argument coming around again, so I quit arguing back. When there was a break in the conversation, I told them I was done with the call and walked back to the maintenance vehicle. I got in with the keys and left. Neither one tried to grab me, take the keys, or block the vehicle. They were still standing there when I drove off. The next morning, I went to my manager first thing and told him what had happened. I kept it to the part I actually knew. Somebody who hadn't been verified as a current resident had called the answering service, given them the correct apartment information, and that had been enough to send the on-call tech out there with master keys. Once the office was open, they checked the actual lease. The guy's name wasn't on it anymore. My manager contacted the woman who lived there. She said she had not called maintenance, had not given her ex permission to enter while she was gone, and hadn't known he'd called the after-hours line. That answered the only part I really needed answered. I had not had permission to open that door. I still don't know what he would have done if I'd let him in. Maybe he really only wanted his things. Maybe not. Nothing later gave me an answer, and I'm not going to pretend there was one. Management went back over the overnight lockout procedure with the answering service afterward. Basically, taking a call and making a ticket couldn't be treated like the person waiting at the building had already been cleared to get in. I still do lockouts, and I still get the same kind of work orders and carry the same master keys. I just don't see a ticket come through anymore, and assume somebody before me already verified the person asking me to open the door. There's a really important distinction here between someone having the correct information and someone having the right to use it. The X knew the apartment number, the resident's name, the building, and enough about the process to generate a completely real maintenance ticket. None of that gave him permission to enter. And I think the maintenance worker handled this exactly the way you'd want someone holding master keys to handle it. He didn't need to accuse the guy of anything. He didn't need to decide whether the breakup story was true. He only needed to notice that authorization was missing and refused to become the person who bypassed that boundary. A real work order can still be built on a false premise. The second story trades a questionable request for something much harder to account for: a person who was definitely there until nobody could find him. I don't know if this is actually as creepy as it felt at the time, but it's one of those things from work that I still can't explain properly. I work evenings at a small city rink. Nothing fancy. Mostly hockey rentals and public skating. On late shifts, I'm usually there through closing with a couple of other employees while the last team clears out and the cleaners finish up. And before anyone asks, no, it's not some high security building where every door is watched. We have a normal closing routine. And after you've worked there long enough, you generally know who should still be around. But people forget stuff in the locker rooms. Staff cut through the service hallway. Doors get dealt with as we get to them. It's organized, just not airtight. This happened after the last hockey rental one night. Most of the players and parents had already left. I was doing one of the usual end-of-night jobs near the rink when one of the cleaners came over and asked if I knew the guy sitting up in the stands. I looked up, and there was one man sitting by himself near the top row, looking down at the empty ice. That was pretty much it. He wasn't doing anything obviously weird. He was just still there when there really shouldn't have been any spectators left. Honestly, my first reaction was annoyance. I figured he was with one of the players, or maybe hadn't realized we were closing. That happens often enough that it doesn't set off alarm bells. It just means you have one more person to get out before you can finish your shift. So I walked over close enough that I didn't have to yell across the arena and told him we were closing and he needed to head out. I don't remember exactly what he said back. I've tried to remember that part, and I honestly can't. It was probably okay or just some little acknowledgement. The important thing is, he didn't argue with me. He got up and started coming down the bleachers like I'd asked. At that point, I thought the problem was solved. When you come down from that side of the stands, you can head back toward the public part of the building. But that same area also leads toward the locker rooms and a service hallway. The guy went toward the locker room side, instead of continuing the way I expected him to. Even then, I didn't think much of it. People double back for equipment all the time after a rental. Maybe he was with one of the players, or maybe he just thought that was the way out. I wasn't going to follow right behind some random guy because he took a different hallway, so I went back to what I was doing and expected him to come back through. Except he didn't. A minute went by, then another. I looked toward the area where he should have come back out, and didn't see him. I checked the stands again too, thinking maybe I'd somehow missed him turning around, but he wasn't there either. That was when it changed for me. It stopped being, some guy doesn't know we're closing, and became, there's a guy somewhere in this building, and I don't know where. I know that probably sounds dramatic, because he hadn't threatened anybody. But when you're closing a workplace, knowing who is still inside matters. You don't want to lock somebody in, and you also don't want some stranger wandering around employee areas after most people have gone home. I wasn't going to check the whole service side alone. I'm not security. I'm just a rink employee, and another guy was still working that night, So I got him and explained what happened. The two of us went the way I'd seen the man go. We checked the locker rooms the last teams had used, then went through the service hallway and looked in the obvious places where somebody could have ended up if they were turned around. We didn't do some giant search of the building. I want to make that clear, because whenever I tell this story, that's the part people start picking apart. We weren't opening every maintenance space or poking around technical rooms over a guy who, so far, had done nothing threatening. We checked the places that actually made sense. The rink is small, but 2 employees still can't watch every door at once. Staff move through the back areas during closing too. So it's not like we could look at one hallway and know exactly who had passed through it a minute earlier. He wasn't in the places we checked. We went through the same general section once more, mostly because by then, I was wondering if I had somehow missed him. Then I asked the cleaner again where she had seen him. She pointed to the same part of the stands and said yes, that was the guy. She'd seen him sitting there before she came to get me. That actually made me feel worse. If I'd been the only person who saw him, I could at least tell myself I was tired and distracted at the end of a shift. But she was the one who noticed him first. The other employee and I talked about it for maybe a minute. We'd checked the obvious places, but neither of us was going to pretend we'd searched every square foot of the rink. For all I knew, the guy had doubled back and found an exit while we were looking somewhere else. That is still what I think probably happened. The problem is, I can't say that it happened. I didn't see him leave. Nobody else on shift told me they saw him leave. After he turned toward that hallway, I never saw him again. So we stopped looking. Neither of us was going to start opening technical rooms or turn it into some kind of manhunt over a guy who technically hadn't done anything except be somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. We still had a rink to close, so we went back to work. The rest of the shift was normal, which somehow made the whole thing more irritating. We didn't see him again, and as far as we could tell, nothing was damaged or missing. We finished closing and went home. I still work there, and I'm not saying I saw a ghost or anything like that. I really don't think that's what happened. A normal trespasser or just some guy who got turned around and slipped out through a part of the building we weren't watching makes way more sense. I just don't know which route he took. The cleaner was more bothered by it than I was. Some of the final checks around the building used to be done alone because there was never much reason not to. After that night, she told us she didn't want to be the last person walking those back areas by herself for a while. I couldn't really blame her. So for a while, we did the final walkthrough in pairs. Picture that rink after closing. Empty ice, mostly cleared stands, and one man sitting alone near the top like he has nowhere else to be. That image is strange, but still completely explainable. Then he walks toward the back of the building and stops being accounted for. I like that the narrator never forces this into a ghost story. He gives the obvious explanation himself. The guy probably doubled back, found another exit, or slipped through an area nobody was watching. That is almost certainly possible, but nobody actually saw it happen. And once the cleaner confirms she saw the same person, the narrator loses the easiest explanation of being tired or mistaken. Nothing terrible happens afterward. That almost makes it better. The only thing left behind is uncertainty, and a closing routine that suddenly feels less comfortable alone. I work nights on a neuro floor, and this happened with one of my older stroke patients. I was his RN that night. I heard him coughing from the hall before I even got into the room. It wasn't the little throat clearing he'd been doing earlier. This was a wet, heavy cough, and with someone who already had a swallowing problem. That gets your attention fast. By the time I got to the bed, he was having more trouble with his secretions than he had been earlier, and his breathing sounded a little rougher too. It wasn't a code or anything close to that. I don't want to make it sound like the room suddenly filled with people and alarms, because it didn't. But it was enough that I stopped what I was doing and stayed with him. He'd had a stroke and failed his swallow evaluation, so he was still NPO until they reassessed him. Basically, nothing to eat or drink by mouth. He knew that and he hated it. His mouth was dry and he'd been asking me for water off and on since I came on shift. Mostly, he wanted ice. I'd already explained why he couldn't have it, and we'd been using mouth care instead. That helped a little, but I also knew how useless that probably sounded to him when what he wanted was a drink. It's one of those restrictions that makes sense medically and still feels pretty awful when you're the person enforcing it. I wasn't annoyed with him for asking. I just couldn't give him what he wanted. Our PCT had been in and out of his room that evening, doing normal bedside care, helping turn him, fixing the bed, that kind of thing. Nothing about her had stood out to me. She wasn't acting careless or weird. She was just working. So when I went in for the coughing, she wasn't even on my mind. I raised the head of the bed, repositioned him, watched his breathing, and let him clear what he could. He coughed for a while, then slowly settled. Once I was reasonably sure he wasn't continuing to get worse, I looked around because I wanted to know if anything had changed. There was a clear plastic cup on the bedside table. It had maybe an inch of water in the bottom, and some droplets inside like ice had been sitting in it and melted. On most patients, that wouldn't have meant anything to me. On this patient, who was NPO, it absolutely did. There shouldn't have been a cup like that next to him. I asked if he'd had anything to drink. He shook his head, then nodded, then tried to explain. His speech was already affected by the stroke, and after all the coughing, he was tired, so I wasn't getting a clean answer. "Just ice," he finally said. "I'm okay." I asked how much. He shrugged and held up a couple of fingers. I still don't know if he meant 2 pieces or if he was just trying to tell me it wasn't much. The PCT came back into the room around then. I pointed at the cup and asked if she knew where it came from. I gave it to him. She didn't hesitate. That honestly threw me more than if she'd gotten defensive, because for a second I thought I must be misunderstanding what she meant. I asked her and she said she'd brought him a few ice chips and given them to him, one at a time. She knew he was NPO. She said that herself before I asked. Her explanation was pretty simple. He had been asking all night, and she felt awful telling him no every time she went into the room. In her head, a few small pieces of ice weren't the same as handing him a cup of water. She thought she was bending the rule a little, not doing something dangerous. I told her the amount wasn't really the issue. His swallowing itself wasn't safe yet. Once the ice melted, even a small amount of liquid could go the wrong way. I wasn't trying to lecture her, and there wasn't any point in giving her a whole speech about aspiration. I just told her that was why the restriction included ice too. She listened, but I could tell she was still stuck on the fact that he'd been miserable. "He was begging me," she said. His mouth was so dry. By then, he was doing better. He was still coughing here and there, but his breathing was much closer to what it had been before. Once I wasn't mainly watching for him to get worse, I had to deal with the other part of it. Somebody on staff had knowingly gone around an order on one of my patients. The PCT wasn't angry. She actually looked upset that I thought she'd put him at risk. She said he asked every time she went in there, and after enough times, it started to feel ridiculous to keep refusing him something as small as ice. I could see why the situation had worn on her. That didn't make the choice okay. But this wasn't someone standing there acting like the order was stupid, or like none of it mattered. Then the patient started trying to defend her. He pointed at her. I asked, "Me?" He coughed and then said she helped me. I told him I knew he'd asked. I wasn't angry with him for being thirsty. Of course he wanted water. I wasn't going to make him feel like he'd done something wrong for asking for it either. He kept trying to tell me she hadn't made him take anything. The way he saw it, she'd listened to him, when the rest of us kept saying, No. The PCT looked miserable by that point. She said she wouldn't do it again. She said she understood what I was telling her now, and that she'd honestly thought a few ice chips were different enough from a real drink, that it would be fine. And I did believe her. That's what made the whole thing uncomfortable. I could understand how she got there, without agreeing with her at all. If somebody keeps asking you for something as basic as water, eventually following the restriction can start to feel mean, especially when you're the person standing there looking at them. But she knew the restriction existed. She had decided on her own that this particular exception was probably harmless. And right afterward, I'd been at the bedside listening to him cough like that. So no, her saying she wouldn't do it again wasn't enough. I told her I was going to have to call the charge nurse and fill out an incident report. She looked at me like I'd taken a small mistake and turned it into something much bigger, over a few pieces of ice. I told her I wasn't trying to make an example out of her. He was NPO. She knew he was NPO, and after the ice, I'd been in there dealing with that wet coughing spell and the change in how he was handling his secretions. I couldn't just have a private conversation with her and leave it there. If he'd had the ice and nothing happened, I still wouldn't have thought it was okay. But now, I had an actual patient change, sitting right in front of the decision she'd made. The patient tried to defend her again. He said he'd asked for it and she'd only been helping. She said basically the same thing. He asked, she wanted to help, and she wouldn't do it again. I told her I understood. I still had to report it. I stepped out far enough to contact the charge nurse, but stayed close to the room, in case he started coughing hard again. When the charge came over, I gave her the facts I actually had. The patient was NPO because of his swallowing issue. The PCT had given him ice anyway. He had the wet coughing spell afterward, and the PCT had told me herself she'd done it because she thought a small amount would be okay. I didn't call her reckless or stupid. That wasn't what I knew, and honestly, it wasn't useful. I just told the charge nurse what had happened. After that, the staffing part wasn't mine to decide. The charge nurse handled it. I went back to the patient, kept watching him, and started the incident documentation. He didn't have some huge emergency afterward. His breathing stayed near baseline. The coughing eased, and the NPO order stayed in place. When his mouth got dry again, I went back to the same mouth care we'd already been using. The charge nurse spoke with the PCT separately. I wasn't part of most of that conversation, so I don't know exactly what was said. What I do know is that the PCT was taken off direct patient assignments for the rest of that shift. She wasn't sent back into rooms to keep doing bedside care that night. I finished the documentation and kept taking care of the patient. I never found out what ultimately happened with the PCT. I don't know if she was written up, suspended, fired, or if nothing else happened after that night. I also don't know of any earlier incidents involving her. The part I still think about is that the patient never seemed to see her as someone who had put him at risk. As far as he was concerned, she was the one person who finally gave him something he'd been asking us for all night. This story is uncomfortable because nobody involved feels like a villain. The patient is desperately thirsty. The PCT feels cruel, refusing him something as basic as ice. Even the nurse understands exactly why that pressure wore her down. But there are moments where caring about someone means refusing what they are asking for. The PCT knew the restriction existed and decided that a small exception was probably safe enough. That is the failure. Not because she wanted to hurt him, but because she replaced a medical order with her own judgment. And immediately afterward, the nurse was dealing with a concerning change in that patient. And then the patient defends her because, from his perspective, she was the only person who listened. That is a brutal little contradiction. The person who feels kindness in the moment may still be the person putting you at risk. I work nights in facilities at a small community college, and this happened last summer while we had a bunch of renovation work going on. Nothing about it scared me when it was actually happening. I didn't see anybody, I didn't think the building was haunted, and I honestly thought I was dealing with contractors who couldn't stick to their hours. The building was still in use. We had some summer classes and evening programs, so it wasn't one of those empty campus situations. The old dining area was closed for renovation though, and separated from the hallway by a temporary construction wall. My regular round still took me right past it, because the mechanical room and a fire exit were farther down that same service corridor. So I passed that wall several times a night. I had no reason to go into the dining area, and I wasn't supposed to wander into an active demolition zone just because I heard something. We had the contractor hours and facilities. If a crew stayed late and nobody had told us, my job was basically to write it in the night log and let my supervisor deal with it later. That kind of thing happened. A crew would run over, somebody would forget an email, whatever. It was irritating, not weird. One night, I was coming back from the mechanical room when I heard a hard metal clatter from behind the wall. The closest thing I can compare it to is cafeteria trays being stacked, or one tray getting dropped onto a pile. Right after that, something rolled across the floor for a few seconds, on hard wheels, and stopped. I could hear people talking too, but it was muffled enough that I couldn't make out any words. I didn't stand there listening. My reaction was pretty much, great. These guys are still here. It was late enough that they should have been gone. So at my next stop, I wrote down the time and noted noise from the dining construction area after contractor hours. Over the next week, I heard similar stuff a few more times. Not every shift, and it wasn't getting worse. One night, I mostly heard that rolling sound again, with a couple of metal bangs. Another night, there was a short conversation behind the wall. I couldn't understand it. There was also one night when I thought I heard part of an announcement from inside. That's probably the detail that sounds strangest now, but at the time, it barely registered. It was just a short burst of a flat voice, like something coming through a school speaker or cafeteria PA. It stopped before I could catch the words. I remember pausing, then deciding somebody probably had a radio on, and continuing my round. All of this went into the same category in my head as somebody drilling too late, or leaving a work light on, something to write down, not something I needed to personally fix. I made a few more notes because that was what the log was for, mostly the time and where I heard it. At one point, I figured there might be another subcontractor crew working in there that hadn't made it onto the schedule I had. I've worked facilities long enough that a communication screw-up like that did not seem far-fetched. Then the noises stopped. I went a few shifts without hearing anything from the dining area, and basically forgot about it. A while later, my supervisor was going through the night logs and asked why I had the dining contractors listed so many times that late. At first, I thought he was correcting the way I'd written the entries. I told him I hadn't actually seen anybody. I'd heard what sounded like people working behind the wall on several nights, so I wrote down the times. He looked through the entries again and told me the crews weren't working nights during those weeks. According to the schedule he had, they should have been off-site well before any of the times I'd written down. That was the first time I actually had to stop and think about it. Even then, my mind didn't jump to anything paranormal. I figured the schedule was wrong, or somebody had gotten access without facilities being told. I also wondered if I was wrong about where the sound was coming from. Buildings do weird things with noise, especially during construction. My supervisor didn't make a big deal out of it, and neither did I. By then, I hadn't heard anything from that corridor for a while anyway. A few days later, I was on campus during the day for a normal facilities job. My supervisor asked me to go with him into the dining construction area because the contractors needed us to locate an old utility shutoff before the next stage of work. That was the first actual reason I'd had to go past a construction wall since the renovation started. I followed him in, still thinking the schedule issue was probably some dumb paperwork problem. What caught me off guard was how much of the place was already gone. From the hallway side, I'd been picturing a cafeteria being renovated. I knew things were torn up, obviously, but in my head, there was still a recognizable kitchen behind that wall, with crews moving around in it. What I walked into was much farther along. A lot of the old kitchen line had been removed. Sections of the walls were opened up, and there were big empty stretches where equipment used to be. Most of the larger stuff was already gone. I stood there for a bit, because I was trying to make that room match the one I'd been picturing during those night shifts. I kept coming back to the tray-like clatter and that rolling cart sound. The whole reason those noises had made sense to me was because I imagined people working around the old dining equipment. So I asked my supervisor when they had actually started pulling the kitchen apart. I expected him to say most of it had happened after my night entries. That would have been the easy answer, and honestly, I wanted it to be the answer. He said the bigger removal work had started earlier. A lot of the old equipment was already out, before the dates we just talked about. I didn't start walking around trying to prove that every sound I'd heard was impossible. There was still construction stuff in there. Things could bang, roll, get dragged around. That wasn't the point. The problem was that the normal scene I'd assumed was behind the wall. A late crew working around a mostly intact cafeteria hadn't really existed the way I'd pictured it. I still had a normal explanation left, which was that I'd mixed up the dates in my head. The noises had happened over several shifts, and enough time had passed that I could have remembered the right events, but put them in the wrong week. That actually seemed pretty likely to me, so I helped my supervisor find the shutoff, finished what we were there to do, and later went back to the facilities office. I pulled the night log and found the entries. They were where I remembered them. Different nights, different times, all written in my handwriting right after I'd heard the noise. Then I checked them against the contractor's schedule we'd been using at the time. The crew should have been gone well before every one of those entries, and the dates were from the period when a lot of the old kitchen equipment had already been removed. The log doesn't tell me what made those sounds. I'm sure people could come up with explanations, and I still try to. Maybe somebody was in there who wasn't on the schedule. Maybe the sound carried from somewhere else, in a way I didn't understand. I can't rule out every normal explanation, and I'm not claiming I proved anything paranormal. What I can't really get around is that I wrote those entries before I knew what the room looked like. At the time, the sounds were ordinary enough that I never questioned them. I heard what I thought was a crew working late, wrote it down like any other contractor issue, and kept doing my job. By the time I found out the schedule didn't fit and saw how far the demolition had already gone, the noises had stopped. I left it there. There wasn't much else I could honestly say I knew. I kept working in the same building through the rest of the renovation, and I never heard anything like that from the dining area again. The night log completely changes how I read this story. Without it, you could explain almost everything through memory. Maybe the narrator mixed up the dates. Maybe the demolition happened later than he remembered. Maybe several ordinary nights blended together after enough time passed. But he wrote the noises down when they happened, before he had any reason to think they were unusual. That doesn't prove anything supernatural. It just removes one of the cleanest ways to dismiss the experience. And I think that restraint is why the story works. He never claims he heard ghosts rebuilding an old cafeteria. He leaves open unauthorized workers, strange acoustics, construction noise, all of it. He simply knows the scene he imagined behind that wall did not match the room that actually existed at the time. Sometimes a record makes an old memory easier to trust, not easier to explain. If there's one feeling running through this batch, it's that uneasy moment when a normal explanation is still available, but it no longer feels complete. Nobody here begins the night expecting anything strange. They're following procedures, finishing shifts, taking care of people, writing routine notes. The tension only appears afterward, when one missing piece refuses to fit. And I think that's why grounded stories like these linger. You can explain most of them, you just can't explain them comfortably. I'd like to know where your instinct would have kicked in. At what point in any of these stories would you have stopped treating the situation as routine? Put your answer in the comments. If this kind of slower, realistic horror is your thing, a like or subscription helps me know to keep bringing more of it here. Thanks for spending the time with me tonight. That's all from me for this one. Take care and goodbye.